Okay. Thanks so much for coming out on this lovely evening. I want to welcome you all to the second event in our Fictions and Forms reading series. Our first this fall was The Great Darren Strauss, a rousing success. Our third and final will be in April with Viet Thanh Nguyen, whose novel The Sympathizer is getting tons of acclaim this year. But our guest tonight is Molly Antopol, and she received just as much acclaim in 2014 with the publication of her story collection, The Un-Americans, right here. I have to tell you the acclaim is totally justified, because personally I do think it's probably the best story collection I've read in like a decade. And I'll tell you why in a bit, but I want to tell you a little bit about Molly. She was, well actually you said you were born in New Haven, right? But you were raised in California, right? She received her MFA from Columbia University. She also received the Radcliffe Institute Fellowship at Harvard, as well as the Stegner Fellowship at Stanford University, where she currently teaches. But The Un-Americans, published by W.W. Norton, is her debut story collection and has won, and I'm going to list them all, the New York Public Library's Young Lions Fiction Award, a 5 Under 35 award from the National Book Foundation, and the Ribilo Prize. It was also longlisted for the National Book Award, was a finalist for the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize for Debut Fiction, the Barnes & Noble Discover Award, the National Jewish Book Award, the California Book Award, and others. And it will be published, if not already, in 7 countries. Now, when you read the collection, you'll see that most of the stories involve characters of Jewish ancestry, from Vermont to New York to California, from Israel to cities all over Europe, from the present day all the way back to World War II. But what connects these characters to each other, what animates their struggles in the stories, is not so much their ethnicity as their confrontation in each story with who they think they are and who they really are, who they can't help being. Failed love, personal tragedy, complicated family dynamics, age-old secrets, all these things inevitably try to define these characters. And what you feel so strongly, or what I felt so strongly, is the sense that in these stories that we often see ourselves most starkly, most truthfully, when we are in pain, or when we see others we care about in pain. And that access to this clarity is only possible through this avenue. At the end of one of Molly's stories, a teenage girl still dealing with her mother's death says to the narrator, "My therapist tells me some things. My therapist tells me other things. I go in and he talks and talks, but I wish he'd stop giving me homework and just tell me how to be happy again." And then a page later, after the girl has accidentally pricked herself on some thorns, the narrator, left with no real words of comfort, no guarantee things would ever get easier, said the only thing she knew for certain, that any moment the poison would kick in, numbing the places that hurt the most. And also, by the way, don't let me mischaracterize the book. It's actually really funny, too. So help me welcome Molly Antopol.
Oh, thank you, Boo. That was the nicest, loveliest, most generous introduction. So thank you so much. And thanks to the University of Chicago and to everyone in the English department and in creative writing for welcoming me. I have been so excited and have been looking forward to this for months. So thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for braving this wild weather and for coming out tonight. So Vu had mentioned The Un-Americans, which is my first book. And it took me so long to write. It took me like 10 years from start to finish for this book. And what I realized, like, once I was done with the book and I was like kind of had all the stories out on the floor and I was trying to figure out the order and trying to just kind of figure out how the book would come together, is that they weren't going to be linked by characters or by setting or by voice, you know, like so many other collections that I really love, you know, because as Vu mentioned, they kind of move from the present day, you know, and back in time, and they take place, you know, everywhere from McCarthy era LA to communist Prague to contemporary Jerusalem and back again. But rather what I realized, like once all the stories were done, was that they were linked by this question that just kept like thrumming underneath the surface the whole time that I was writing, which was like, what happens when the cause that you dedicated your life to loses relevance in the course of world events. And like, what do you do with yourself after that? And what do you do when this thing that meant everything to you is gone and you don't have this common cause and you don't have these people kind of there with you to, you know, to be working towards something? And so that was something that I wasn't even aware that I was really writing until the book was done and I was able to kind of see it all in the stories. And so I thought tonight what I would do is read short excerpts from two of the stories so that you can get a bit more of a sense of the book. The first story that I'll read from is called A Difficult Phase, and it's the one that Vu read the end of about the young girl who's lost her mom. And the thing is, my stories are all super long. They're all like 25 to 35 pages. I have to say, with every one of them, I was hoping so much to do like a perfect 10-pager, because then I might have an easier time getting it published, and like I would have this thing that worked great for readings. And like every time I would finish a story, it was always like, you know, 2 or 3 times as long. And so I think it's just kind of the way I write, and I just had to accept it. But anyway, so this story is called A Difficult Phase, and I'll just read a few pages from it. And it's about a young Israeli journalist named Talia, who is stationed in Kiev, and then her career and basically kind of her whole life is upended after America's most recent economic crash. And so that was kind of interesting for me to think about how it was affecting someone, you know, so far from here. "When are you coming back?" her parents would ask during their weekly calls. They thought she was insane for wanting to report on the very city her grandparents had worked so hard to flee. The moment Talia heard their voices, she felt as if she'd been yanked across the Mediterranean and transported back home. Her father on the porch listening to the radio, her mother always beside him, shelling fava beans or peeling beets, her 2 sisters chasing after their toddlers while their husbands relaxed on the lawn. "Things are working out here," Talia would tell them, wondering how just having them on the end of the line could make her feel as defensive as she'd been at 16. And the truth was that things had been working out. Talia had wanted to be a reporter since she could remember, and it had stunned her, sitting in her cubicle in Kiev, that her life was actually unfolding the way she had fantasized. She'd started at the Jerusalem bureau of an American paper right out of college, doing whatever grunt work was needed, filing, fact-checking, going on coffee runs when the intern was busy. But her English was near fluent, and after years of begging and badgering the bureau chief, he finally started giving her work, as if the very behavior that had gotten her sent to the corner as a child was the thing that garnered his respect. It was true, he said, that she was living in one of the hardest countries to find staff jobs. No one ever left their positions at the Israeli papers, and reporters from all over the world competed for work at the foreign ones. But with her language skills, probably the one time her Slavic literature degree made her more employable, he'd lobby the higher-ups in New York to send her to Kiev if things got bad enough to need someone on the ground. That was 4 years ago, in the fall of 2004, and Talia remembered sitting in the flickering, fluorescent-lit conference room of the Jerusalem bureau, watching it all unfold on TV. The election fraud allegations, Yushchenko's terrifying, ever-changing face, and holding on to a shameful, selfish hope for things to keep spiraling. She'd always felt so envious of the other reporters at her paper in Jerusalem, none of them Israeli, all of them cabbing over to the bar at the American Colony Hotel every night after work, as if living out some vintage fantasy. They were all smart, they all spoke the language, many had relatives there and knew the country even before they were hired. But there was something so romantic about the way they saw their jobs, sinking into chairs in the garden bar, press passes still dangling from their necks, immediately launching into thrilling tales of how they were this close to danger that day, before pausing and taking a handful of the free cashews on the table. Even her bureau chief, whom Talia genuinely admired, still acted as though he was playing the part of the daredevil reporter, always driving himself into the territories, traveling with a separate passport through Lebanon and Syria, as if relentlessly performing for a rapt, imaginary audience back home in America. It had always bothered Talia, listening to them debate her country's politics, when it was implicitly understood that the moment their brushes with danger went from being this close to way too fucking close, they could leave. But then she was given the same opportunity, to be lifted from her life and plunked down in a place to which she had an even flimsier connection than many of her coworkers had to Israel, and she'd found herself guilty of that same excitement. Anyone would have felt it covering the demonstrations, of course, but she'd been just as amped in the months that followed, sitting in the stuffy, windowless media room in the district courthouse, or transcribing at her desk for hours, eating meal after meal of crackers with chocolate spread, as if everything took on a significance she'd never felt back home, the thrill of living on the other side of the glass. Even the things in Kiev that should have frustrated her, the weather, the drunks who catcalled her on her way to work, the horrible bureaucracy that made even cashing her... Jason! Sorry, Jason is an old friend I haven't seen in forever. That horrible bureaucracy that made even cashing her paycheck feel like that nightmare where she was walking down a long hallway and every door led to yet another endless hallway of doors, seemed funny and removed, as if they were simply anecdotes in an elaborate story she'd tell one day to her own imaginary audience back home. Her office building in Kiev housed foreign correspondents from all over the world, and she loved how easily they buffered the loneliness of living in a new place, heading down to Baraban, which had quickly become their default bar, every evening after work. Those nights, squeezed into a booth with her office mates and a roving crew of aid workers and NGO groupies, even her life in Israel seemed a little lighter, a little more entertaining than it had actually been. As if she weren't even describing her own neighborhood, her own family, but a cast of pushy and lovable characters on some wacky sitcom. Then came the financial crash, and her bureau chief called from Jerusalem with the news that the New York paper was closing some of its foreign desks, Kiev among them. It had nothing to do with her work, he said. They just couldn't afford to keep her when they could get copy from the AP. Try not to panic, he said. What's that saying about things going to shit right before they're good again? He laughed, but it sounded breathless and raw, like he was blowing out a match. Then he cleared his throat and suggested she go freelance, which Talia did, though soon even that became difficult and she had to cut her rates by half. And one night she walked over to Baraban for a much-needed drink and found the place full of 20-something American bloggers. They'd set up shop there, a cluster of them laughing and yelling in English, the other port patrons forced to weave around their power cords, as if the Americans and their laptops had become as essential to the bar as its wobbly chairs and shelves of bottles that lined the wall. You're lucky, one of her old office mates said. He seemed to have implanted himself at the bar since his own layoff, and had the sallow pallor of a man who'd spent too many consecutive days drinking indoors. You can go home and some war will start up again. He was Danish, and Talia detected a spark of envy in his gaze. Go back and wait, he said. So Talia wrote to every contact she had in Israel, including her former boss at the American paper, who said he'd gotten word that they were now closing all the foreign desks and reshuffling the staff back home, and that he could tell her exactly what the job market was like, because after 33 years he was back in it, groveling for positions at wires he'd been overqualified for 2 decades ago. The only place where he could put in a call for her, he said, was at the Free City, the paper the two of them used to mock, sing-songing the glowing profiles of the wealthy businessmen who clearly funded it and their Judaica artist wives. But Talia knew she had no choice but to gratefully accept the offer. And though it was even worse than the first job she'd taken out of college, and though the pay was so low she'd had to move back in with her parents, back into her childhood bedroom, which was no longer her bedroom but her mother's extended storage closet. The key, she told herself, was to view her time home as a disappointing but brief blip in her real life abroad. So that's just like a little bit from the story, A Difficult Phase. And now what I thought I would do is just read a few pages from a story that will kind of take you guys back to the U.S., to this tiny college town in Maine, where there is a former Czech dissident named Tomáš who's teaching there. And he has a fractured relationship with his ex-wife and daughter. To say the least, I would call it fractured. And he's just learned that his daughter, whose name is Daniela, has written a play, and that it's going to be produced off Broadway. And she says, and he knows that it's about this family. And he's massively paranoid and stressed out that this play is going to expose him and is going to expose his shortcomings as a father. And so he strong-arms his daughter to come up to Maine for the weekend so he can get his hands on the play and kind of force her to revise the play. I wanted to read a couple pages from that also, since it's sort of, kind of moving into a different place. And I'll just read a few pages as he's preparing for his daughter Daniela's visit, and he's looking back on his early years right when he came to the U.S. So his daughter's Daniela, and his ex-wife is Katka. And the story is called The Quietest Man, and you can just picture me, a paranoid middle-aged Czech man, as I read. So probably not very hard. So he's thinking about these early years. Katka, I imagine, would begin by saying I was the one who dragged her to America in the first place. He's thinking about just like, what is this play going to be about, and what does my daughter think of me? And he's just in this massive state of panic. Would begin by saying I was the one who dragged her to America in the first place. In Prague, we had written anonymously with our colleagues for the journal, The Chronicle of Our Time. We wrote by hand. The government had a record of everyone who owned typewriters, and late at night I'd sneak into different university buildings to type the materials. Every time we finished an issue, we distributed it to people we knew, who then passed it along to people they knew, until we had thousands of readers throughout the country. But when the STB still managed to link me to a typewriter, I was brought in for questioning and fired from my teaching post. At the time, Katka had seemed like the lucky one. She was on maternity leave that term and so avoided suspicion. But it was my name people chanted outside the university. It was my name that made international headlines and reached the desk of Saul Sandalowski, the Collins College professor who campaigned to get me a visa and a teaching job to avoid imprisonment. She'd tell Daniela about packing our entire flat in 3 days before boarding the long flight to the States. She'd talk about the brick faculty apartment that awaited us in Vermont, boxy and carpeted and new, 1,000,000 times nicer than our flat back home, but dimly quiet without our friends crowded around the living room, chatting away the evening. She'd talk about how my assistant professor's salary barely covered our rent, let alone food or doctor's bills. And she'd talk about working the early morning shift as a janitor at the college, mopping the same mahogany classrooms I lectured in, emptying the garbage can full of my students' crumpled napkins and paper coffee cups. Katka came from a long line of intellectuals. She was the one who was supposed to be offered a professorship in America. Her father had been shipped to a psychiatric prison for writing his own anti-government pieces when Katka was still a baby, and an enormous part of her childhood was watching her mother devote herself to getting him out. I remember meeting Katka back in university and trying to impress her with my big ideas, only to realize the political books I was reading for the first time were ones she had already dissected and gleaned an understanding of years ago. There was something so exciting, almost romantic, about watching this brawny college girl reduce my ideas to a lumpy pile of porridge, making me feel not like a rising star at the university, but what I really was, deep down, a skinny kid from a family of uneducated dairy farmers. A big part of me had always believed I was destined to ride her coattails. I could see how hard the move to Vermont was on her. I could see it in the way she closed into herself when I dragged her to cocktail hour at the provost's house, the way even meeting me for a quick lunch before class made her anxious. The woman who had once stood outside party headquarters chanting STB equals Gestapo was suddenly afraid to order at the campus sandwich shop because she didn't understand the menu. At this point, Katka would say the transition would have been difficult no matter what, but that I certainly didn't help. She'd say even when I was home, I wasn't really there. At the dinner table or lifting a crying Daniela from her crib, I always seemed to be silently working on another essay. How I ducked into my study at every possible moment. How birthdays and anniversaries slipped into a murky, irretrievable place in my mind. But how I never seemed to forget the dates of Saul Sandalowski's dinner parties. And she would be right. But those dinners, Saul with his floppy wheat-colored hair and shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, clamping a hand on my shoulder as he led me inside. His stone house on Seminary Road, so mazy and grand I always got lost looking for the bathroom. I was the honored guest, the man with the stories scholars and journalists and philanthropists wanted to hear. And so, over glasses of Borello, I told them about the two STB officials waiting outside the political science department. Tomasz Novak, one had said, and I had said, "Why do you need to know?" And they dragged me into a black service car. It was late April, sunny but cold, and as we pulled away from the curb, I saw people outside the university, staring away or feigning conversation so they wouldn't be witnesses. In the headquarters, the officials led me down a long hallway into a windowless room with white walls and a steel desk with a green-eyed, round-faced man behind it. He calmly asked me to name the other writers involved in the journal. I refused. He asked again. He asked again and again, so many times that the hours began to blur and I couldn't tell if we'd entered the next day. All over Czechoslovakia, writers were breaking down and naming names. But did they really believe sleep deprivation would crack a father with a newborn, I joked to Saul's guests? Though I remembered the moment I'd started to cry, sitting in that hard back chair as I recalled stories of people brought in for questioning and never heard from again. The lights were bright, and one of the chair legs was shorter than the others, so I felt as if I was perpetually sliding off. And every time I nodded into sleep, the man would slam his desk drawer shut, jolting me awake. But I continued to refuse. And when one of Saul's guests would ask where that bravery came from, as someone always did, I'd tell them we all had a reserve for when we needed it most. I believed that, though sometimes I wondered if I could ever depend on it again. When I was finally released, word spread and I became famous among other writers. They called me the quietest man. Yet as I circulated Saul's living room, with Brubeck on the stereo and little salmon crudités being passed around, I understood I could finally name the names of the chronicle writers without consequence. So I told them about Katka Novak, my brave, brilliant wife, who unfortunately wasn't here this evening because we couldn't find a sitter, I lied, when in truth she rarely wanted to leave the apartment anymore. My wife who, for the 4 days I remained quiet in the interrogation room, was anything but. With a newborn on her hip, she led rallies outside the university, marching through Nove Mesto and up to a podium in Wenceslas Square. She spoke with such force that she persuaded an American reporter to write a piece about me. So while people with less evidence against them were jailed, enough support came through that my family and I were given emergency clearance. And when I described Katka to Saul's guests, it was like she was back up on the podium, drawing so large a crowd that children climbed the trees to glimpse her. But then Saul's dinners would end, and I'd tiptoe into our silent apartment and find the new Katka in bed with the lights off. "You awake?" I'd whisper, a little drunk off the Borello as I ran a finger along her pale, freckled arm. "No," she'd say, rolling over. And it was only hours later, as the sun came up and I walked her through campus, that she'd unlock the lecture hall with her chunky ring of janitor's keys and say, "Imagine eating alone while I was at dinner parties." That's how Katka was. She'd pick up a conversation I thought had ended eons ago without ever reintroducing the topic. "I'm not saying we go home. I know we can't," she'd say, "but maybe New York. Somewhere," she said, "with people like us. Somewhere that didn't feel like the edge of the earth." But before I could answer, the first students of the day would breeze past us as if we were no more significant than the chalkboards and long wooden desks that filled the room. Katka continued to push the idea of moving to New York, but things were changing for me at work, and fast. Katka said I was being selfish. I told her I was working hard for all of us. She said I owed it to our daughter to be home more, that if I didn't consider her feelings, she'd leave me and take Daniela to stay with her second cousin in Queens. I begged her not to, but there was a secret part of me that wanted her to go, that longed to be free from the responsibility of my family. I wasn't ready to leave Vermont. Not when I felt my life there opening up, wider and wider. Of course, I didn't really expect a woman with no money and next to no English to leave, and it was only when I made the first custody drive down the Taconic that it actually felt real. Of course, I didn't expect Katka to find steady enough work cleaning houses in New York, or that she'd parlay it into her own business with a dozen employees. And of course, I didn't expect that 3 years after Katka left, communism would collapse and the work I dedicated my life to would be done. That the dinner discussions at Saul Sandalowski's would suddenly revolve around Bosnia, and that a young female Serb would become Saul's newest honored guest. And I certainly didn't expect that same woman to win tenure over me. That my 30s and 40s would be about mastering the delicate, tricky dance of pleading for adjunct work up and down the East Coast, Albany, Durham, Burlington, and now, for the past 2 years, in Harpswick, Maine, which, if Katka had thought of Vermont as the edge of the earth, would have made her feel she'd fallen off completely. I'll stop there.